Good morning, everyone. Welcome and Gay Tatumskata Nawao. I'm going to begin now, although I suspect that a few more people will join us, but they will only miss me speaking and not this morning's guest speaker. So I think that that's just as well, and we can begin. Before we do so, I would like to acknowledge that the land currently known as the province of Saskatchewan is comprised of portions of lands from treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. The territories of Nahiwak, Anishinaabe, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis. I'm speaking to you today from my home office on Treaty 4 territory in Regina, and as both a relative newcomer to Saskatchewan and as a guest on this land. I have learned to, and I really like to give land and treaty acknowledgements. I look on doing so as a challenge to myself. How can I live in better relationship with the land and with the natural world around me? How can I live in better relationships with all of the people who share this particular space? As I pay my respects to the people who lived here before me and reaffirm our relationship with each other, I challenge you to join me as we look for ways to live together in greater mutual respect for each other and for the Earth Mother. My name is Michael Jones, and I'm the CEO of Sask Arts. And I'm pleased to welcome you to the first of Sask Arts Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Speaker Series during the winter of 2022. Like many of your companies, Sask Arts is highly engaged in work right now around access and inclusion. We recognize that the original principles on which public arts funding began in Canada were highly racist, and they were meant to prioritize white Eurocentric artistic forms, and that these principles still form the basis of the structures in operation today. We've been struggling with how to address this and change these systems, and Sask Arts has been devoting significant internal resources to this work. Over the past year, we've had opportunity to hear from a number of speakers who are challenging us to be better. But as we've been benefiting from this professional development, we thought it was important to share some of this work, some of these speakers with you, with the arts community in the province, as a way of providing resources that go beyond our grants and our funding. So over the next 3 months, we will be presenting 3 speakers who we hope can stimulate all of us in our work to address the complex web of inequities in the Saskatchewan and Canadian arts communities. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'll provide some information and possibly set some ground rules so that this could be as effective as possible for all participants. Closed captioning is available for this series. To access the captioning, click on the live button at the top left of your Zoom screen. The captioning should open in a different browser window so you can follow along with the conversation there. To limit distractions for participants, we've turned off your cameras and your microphones. Also, if you're using the chat function in Zoom, please use it only to send messages to single individual recipients. Messages that pop up on people's screens can also be distracting, but we're choosing to keep the chat function active in order to allow you to ask questions. If you have a question for Manuela, she's indicated that she may be able to address simple clarifications during the presentation, and we will certainly have a Q&A afterwards. The best way to get questions answered is to send them by private message directly to me, Michael Jones. I will moderate both questions during the presentation and the Q&A. It's probably easiest to send it to me as a private message because I don't always catch everything in the general chat. We will be recording today's session, and we will be making it available through the Sask Arts website in case you want to view it again later, or if you wish to recommend it to colleagues who weren't able to join you this morning. And now I'm going to turn over speaking duties to Dr. Manuela Valle-Castro, the Director of Social Accountability at the University of Saskatchewan's College of Medicine. Valle-Castro is originally from Chile and is mestiza of Spanish, Italian, and Afro-Indigenous heritage. She holds a PhD from the University of British Columbia, where her work focused on gender, race, sexuality, and social justice. Based solely on the advanced materials that she provided for our review, I'm really excited to hear what Manuela has to share today. I acknowledge I'm a privileged white man, and I was particularly moved by Dr. Robin DiAngelo talking about white privilege and the often unrecognized ways it can hold prevalence in my work, my thinking, my life. So I would thank her for providing that as one of our advanced materials. During her presentation, Manuela will speak directly to limitations of work focused on diversity and equity, particularly when it comes to effectively addressing systemic inequities. As noted before, if you have questions, please send them directly to me by private message. But now I'll turn over to Manuela. Manuela?
Thank you, Michael, and good morning to everybody that is in the room. I am very happy to see such a great turnout, so thank you for showing up for equity. And I'm gonna share my slideshow here. I also see a couple of peeps, familiar names here, so I'm glad to see some familiar names. And hopefully we'll have a great, fruitful conversation at the end. And as Michael indicated, my talk today focus on looking at the limitations of diversity and inclusion as a framework and moving towards a framework that allows us, that gives us a language to focus on equity and systemic oppression. And as Michael also indicated, I am a grateful yet uninvited guest of Treaty 6 as well, the homeland of the Métis and the ancestral lands of many sovereign indigenous nations. And I also constantly use my land acknowledgement as a way to reflect on my own responsibilities as a guest here in reaffirming the treaties and interrupting and redressing the colonial harms and seek allyship with indigenous people. So I do work at the College of Medicine at the university doing equity work and anti-racism, anti-oppression work. You already heard a little bit about my background, and the only reason I like to talk a little bit about my background is that you understand where I'm speaking from, and also because there's something interesting that you can learn from my background that is it was quite interesting to me. And it's that even though I'm, you know, when I say that I have mixed ancestry and I say I'm mestiza, right, that sounds very exotic to you folks in North America, right? The fact that I say, yeah, I have on one hand European blood, Spanish Italian, and on the other one Afro-Indigenous. However, in the context of South America and in the context of Spanish colonialism, mestizos, we are actually pretty high up in the racial hierarchy, right? Like first there was the continental, the Europeans born, and in Europe, then the Europeans, the criollos, Europeans born in the Americas, and then mestizos, right? Mixed blood, but mestizos are the ones that ended up forming governments that claimed independence from the colonies. So we are the dominant majority. And this is interesting because I didn't see myself as a racial minority until I came to Canada, right? So my experience growing up in Chile was of being part of the dominant majority, which in other words, it's experiencing whiteness, experiencing the privilege of not being, of being assumed the best, being counted among the best of all of us, right? Like people expected that I was gonna go to university and become a professional, also because of kind of like middle class privilege, right? But like I wouldn't be, you know, followed in stores as opposed to an indigenous or an Afro-descendant person. So I just want to point that out to you because it's going to be interesting for us to understand what we're talking about when we talk about race, right? That it's really about a social and political order rather than as a biological thing that lives in our, or in other words, I always have the same ancestry, but it means different things in different contexts. And what it means in those different contexts is what we call race, okay? So just hold on to that idea. I thought I would use this initial talk for your series to really kind of like, you know, clarify a little bit all the language that we have going around pertaining different things that are kind of related but are not the same, right? So we, for example, hear a lot about equity, but you know, just to say equity, what does that mean? Multiculturalism seems to be like the dominant approach in Canada for the you know, last decades. How is that different from saying systemic racism? I thought we were a mosaic, right? What is cultural awareness, responsiveness, right? And how is it different from cultural safety, for example, right? Is it just that we need to learn about other cultures, what we need to do to address the issues that we have? Then there's diversity and inclusion, right? And sometimes equity, diversity, and inclusion are put together, but the emphasis is in diversity and inclusion. Then we have indigenization and, right, and reconciliation. So we're gonna try to kind of like tease out what these terms mean, and especially how are they different? Right, so to get, oh, and something that it's really important that I wanted to say is that my talk has been really geared to talk to create reflection on settler people, whether they're white settlers or racialized settlers like me. But I do want to give a sort of like a trigger warning if you are an Indigenous participant, because we will be talking about traumatizing or information that can be re-traumatizing, and images that can be triggering about colonial violence. So I just want to please anticipate that if you're an Indigenous participant, I invite you to take to see these workshops with a little bit of distance, to allow yourself to take pauses and hopefully check in with supports if you have, and reach out if you need extra supports at the end, if you need to debrief, or if I can direct you to some resources, because I've been, you know, it's been pointed out to me that I sometimes forget that, you know, people that are in the room sometimes don't only know exactly what we're talking about, but they've lived it. So it's important that we, you know, take care of everybody in the room. So the first question that I had for you is, when we talk about things like inequities and racism, right, there's a lot of emotions that come up, right? Even when we say things like settler, and people are like, no, I'm not a settler, I'm a Canadian. So I wanted to start with this image, which is, you know, you're all related to the art world. So imagine that you're familiar with this artist. This is Kent Monkman, an Indigenous Two-Spirit artist who has kind of like given us images to come to terms with some of the violent colonial history and ongoing colonial policies that we have to come to terms with, right? So I like to use this image to invite you to think about, what do you think it's in the minds of the RCMPs and the priests that are depicted in this image, which is an image that you know, we can associate with the beginning of the Indian Act and apprehension of Indigenous children for residential schools, which was compulsive. compulsory. So when we talk about colonial harm and colonial violence, are we talking about bad individuals? Are we just to deduce from this image that there were bad individuals represented by the people with you know, the missionaries and the RCMP? So is this about villains and victims, people with bad intentions? Well, when we're talking about systemic racism, we're moving beyond the idea that racism is sort of like an individually rooted belief or attitude or behavior, right? That we just have to fix by, like, you know, by intervening the individuals. That racism is not just an event, right? And for example, colonialism is not an event, right? But it has to do with a system of narratives and messages, right? That have been normalized, made normal in our institutional practices. Things that we have now deemed normal. For example, right? This is institutional practice that has become normal, acceptable, tolerable, desirable. Also, we know that this image that I just showed you has a parallel today with in our province with the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in foster care, which in our province is 86% of kids in foster care are Indigenous. So when we're talking about things like systemic oppression and systemic racism, we're not talking about conscious and deliberate behavior, individual behavior that is dependent on good intentions, right? We have all good intentioned people. We have a lot of people with, or to quote the book by Eduardo Bonilla Silva, there is no racist. We have racism without racists. Nobody's racist, yet we have racism, right? So we have to, the invitation in this talk is to start thinking about oppression as normalized. Oppression is already embedded in the structure of the everyday normal for us, right? It's entrenched psychologically, and it's entrenched institutionally. And this is why okay, difficult, okay. In anti-racism and anti-oppression, right, this is what we focus on. We try to systematically pay attention to the narratives, right, the messages that inform the practices and policies, yeah, that are having the outcomes that we have now, which we know are terrible. This is a framework that understands diversity as an effect of equity and not the other way around. So pay attention for me for a second. I'm going to give you like a really big spoiler alert or important question for this talk. When we're talking about diversity and inclusion, the first thing that we have to ask ourselves is, why is there no diversity to begin with, right? Why does our board look like what it looks like? Why does our list of prime ministers look like what they look like? What does our history of deans in the College of Medicine? So we have only two ways to interpret the lack of diversity. Okay, maybe I'll go, oh no, I wanted to go to another, but spoiler alert, why we only have two ways to explain the lack of diversity that we have in institutions. One is that people who are not in the room are not skilled enough to be there, not smart enough to be there, not interested enough to be there, right? So we call that deficit discourse, right? Or, right, the other interpretation is that there were barriers on the road to come to the table, right? And this is going to be very important for us when we talk about diversity and inclusion, okay? So hold on to that thought. So what we really focus is on looking at structures of power, privilege, and oppression. And it's not just like informing people that racism exists. It's really about transforming those really deeply entrenched messages that we hold and that feed things like benevolent racism, like the one that we saw depicted in the Monk Man painting, right? And we challenge that color blindness is going to take us anywhere. So saying that you don't see color doesn't help at all, because that denies the existence of systemic racism, which is not very helpful. The invitation in an anti-racism or an equity framework, an anti-oppression and an anti-racism framework that focuses on equity as the outcome, forces us to stop looking at the other who has been deemed the problem, right? So in many approaches like multiculturalism or cultural awareness, cultural responsiveness, right? We are invited, right? So look at my stock image on the left, right? The magnifying glass. We're invited to study the other. What is wrong with the other, right? That is not, you know, performing as well, right? What is wrong with women that they don't participate in politics? What is wrong with people of color that they don't achieve, you know, leadership positions? What is wrong with the other, right? And in an anti-oppression, anti-racism framework that it's focused on equity, we shift the focus, right, from the other, the deviant other that is not, right, that is not being included, to look at the institution and the dominant center, right, to look at what are the barriers in the institution, who is at the center, right, that has created these barriers. And this is why, right, when we talk about, when we talk about the magnifying glass, right, is looking at the other. And now what we're gonna try to look is at the dominant majority. Hello, you in the mirror, it's me, right? So that's why if you are a settler in Treaty 6, it's very important that before you engage in any kind of solidarity work that has to do with racial equity and racial justice, you have to understand your own story, right? And understand how is it that you ended up, you know, in the place where you are. And that you can have an understanding of how you have potentially power to be an ally to people that has been excluded, pushed to the margins, right? So we can, if we are the person without a wheelchair that made it to the meeting, and you realize that there's no ramp, therefore nobody with a wheelchair can make it, you can be the person that says, hey, you guys, you know, now that I'm here, I noticed that somebody that doesn't have the ability to walk here couldn't make it through, right? So I'm gonna introduce you to a way of thinking about, in particular about racism and why is it, so to talk about why diversity and inclusion, right, cannot serve us well without a focus on equity. It's important that we understand that oppression, right, in this case, racism is layered in a way that I like to compare with the metaphor of an onion, right? And I like the metaphor of an onion because it's got, not only it's got layers, but the outside, the outward oldest layer contains everything inside, all the layers inside, right? So when we're talking about, dealing with racism, and we say, yes, what we need is to ask people to just respect each other at an interpersonal level, right? We'll ask people to be nice to each other and don't say racist things to each other, right? And we'll intervene here at the level of the individuals, right? However, when we look at this onion, we see that that level of the individual is just this one layer, right, within a whole onion again, right? So if we cut the onion in half, we'll see that the oldest layer, right, is the one that is the policies, right, and the practices that organize our society at the most basic level, right? So the policies that structure the distribution of land and resources and political power, right? And we'll talk about some of those. I like to talk about cultural racism as the layer that buffers this first layer because it gives it kind of like a justification, right? We'll talk about that. Institutions then are already embedded within a system, right, that has a political social order and has a narrative to justify it. So institutions already work within that. And within institutions, people, right, have been socialized to act in a particular way. And what is inside the onion, that tender center, right, that is our own internalized racism. So everything that we hold unconscious, right? And this, of course, also impacts people of color in the way that we internalize our own inferiority, or women for that matter, right? Internalize your own inferiority in a system that has told you that you are inferior. So why have I been talking so much about anti-Indigenous racism? Aren't there any other, like, what about, Black people and Asian people? And yes, of course, yes, Canada has been incredibly, we have a history of like anti-Asian, anti-Black policies right here in Saskatchewan that we could really focus on. However, the reason I'm calling your attention to this is because in the prairies, anti-Indigenous racism is the most prevalent form of institutionalized racism. And we know that because of the outcomes, and not just the health outcomes, but as I was saying before, the rates of children in foster care, right? So we know that roughly Indigenous people are about 17% of the population of Saskatchewan. And 80%, so every 100 kids in foster care, 86 are Indigenous. The last time I checked, the rate of over-incarceration of Indigenous people in Saskatchewan was between 80 and 90, with 95 to 98 for women. Okay? So, and we have in the prairies a very strong settler colonial myth that presents Indigenous people as the problem, right? We actually talk about Indigenous problems or Indigenous issues, right? As opposed to talking about colonial problems and who has created the outcomes for Indigenous people. So we have a narrative that has been blaming Indigenous people for their intergenerational poverty and the outcomes in terms of intergenerational trauma on themselves, right? We have a racist narrative based on white supremacy, right? On scientific racism that I don't have time to go into all the history of that, but really attributing the outcomes of indigenous people to inferior morals, inferior intelligence and skills, bad choices, lack of work ethic, etc. So, for example, in terms of health, right, we know that indigenous people have catastrophic outcomes when it comes to health, in particular in Saskatchewan. And these are not particularly indigenous issues in terms, again, that they have been the result of what indigenous people have done, but actually have been a result of violent colonial policy. So, what am I talking about? The health outcomes that we have for indigenous people can be linked directly to colonial discourses. I mean, they can be the outcomes in health, right, can be directly associated with these social determinants of health, which are a result of policy, right? So we're talking about inflicted poverty, inflicted food insecurity, inflicted housing insecurity, etc. So when you read the article by Dr. Sheila McLean, right, that kind of like, and we're going to get to that, she listed some of the policies that created intergenerational poverty and intergenerational trauma for indigenous people, right? So these health outcomes cannot be understood without these social determinants of health, right? But if we didn't look at those social determinants of health, right? If you cover that part of your screen for a second, and you only saw the health outcomes, right? You could confirm the colonial discourses and the anti-indigenous stereotypes and biases. You could say, see, indigenous people are inferior. That's why they have poorer overall health, higher rates of HIV, like impacted most by the opioid crisis, etc. Right? But it's when you look at this side of the practices that are informed by the messages that you understand the outcomes. Yeah. Now, why are we not outraged about these outcomes? Why are we not burning down the house about the outcomes? It's because we have been taught it's not our fault. The reason that, again, people live in poverty, marginalization, oppression, and violence, it's because they are like that, right? And that's the only outcome for indigenous people, right? So before we go there, let me show you this beautiful picture that I love so much. So the policies that created intergenerational poverty and intergenerational trauma, right, were created by a group of people that looked like this, right? So if we go back, and I was talking about structural racism, like the Indian Act and the oldest layers of policies, right? The people that created the most fundamental policies that organize our society looked like this, right? And they had a bias, of course, and not because they were bad people, right? But because they had, you know, a cultural bias to reassure and confirm their power and authority. So when we ask, why is, for example, in this cabinet, why is there no diversity to begin with, right? Was it because, again, deficit discourse, women were not interested in coming to the cabinet, Chinese people were invited, but they had other commitments, indigenous people said, meh, like, is that what happened? Or maybe they were like not smart enough to want to participate in politics. That would be deficit discourse, right? Why is this cabinet not diverse, right? However, we know that the reason that this cabinet, right, as an example, is not diverse and it looks like one type of person and one type of person only, right, is that there were explicit barriers. Women and people of color were explicitly excluded from these spaces by legislation, right? So when we talk about equity, I want you to look at these three images for a second, right? Maybe you've seen it tons of times, right? The one here on the left is equality, right? When we say, okay, now it's legal for women to vote, or it's legal for, you know, for anybody to come to the table, to come to the baseball game. It's legal, right? However, you see that there's a barrier here, right? The barrier is that you had to pay to get to the game. So, you know, to begin with. So we say, don't worry, we'll give you equality. We'll give you all the same support, right? We'll give you all a box that looks the same. But in this image, this guy was already tall enough that he could have looked just over without the box. This guy could make a great use of that box. This guy was so short that it didn't make a difference for him, right? On the second image, we are applying what we call equity policies, equitable policies, right? We gave everybody what they needed, right, to be able to see through the barrier, right? So this guy didn't need anything, this guy needed one box, this guy needed two, right? But equity policies are only there to correct, right? To correct the fact that there was a barrier. So ultimately what we want is justice, right? Meaning that there is no barriers so that we don't have to support people with specific things. This is while we're transforming the bigger structures, right? So this is a chart that I was talking about that I shared with you in the Sheila McLean article, which compares again, Sheila McLean using the story of her own family, unpacks what are the specific policies that allowed her family to accumulate, to come, you know, to quote the title, with nothing, right? Come with nothing, fresh off the boat Europeans, and be able to build a life from nothing. However, with these policies benefiting them, right? Benefiting their hard work and effort. What happened with the hard work and effort of indigenous people? It wasn't just not rewarded, it was tempered, right? I don't know if I'm using the right term, but it was, there were multiple barriers, right, to participate both in politics, in society, and economically, right? So if Sheila McLean concludes that her family could accumulate not just some like intergenerational wealth, right, but also a sense of pride and ownership, that for indigenous people, for a lot of indigenous people, what they were able to accumulate was intergenerational poverty and intergenerational trauma, right? But if we don't look at these practices and we just look at the outcomes, right, what can we conclude? All white people are just better farmers, right? Or indigenous people were just not into farming or not into participating into politics, etc. So again, shifting the attention from looking at what's wrong with the other to turning our full attention to the center. And what do we find at the center is this invisible center of whiteness and masculinity. That again is not that if you're a white man, you're mean and you're bad and you won't be friends with me. No, it means that historically, right, power and authority, knowledge, right, was constructed, right, in this current system with whiteness and masculinity, right, in this Western colonial patriarchal system, as the norm, the dominant, the default, right? So we say, well, we have doctors and then we have female doctors, right? We have artists and female artists. You know what I mean? Like we have to qualify when it's the other, right? But when it's the invisible norm, it just means immediately is white and male is like the default norm. Yes, and in Canada in particular, right, the other has always been the problem as opposed to, right? Cautious of the time, but I'm looking for a face here. If somebody can tell me how roughly how much longer I can go on to see if I can keep going the long way or have to take a shortcut.
I think Jeff said we were scheduled for up to 90 minutes. So if you want to think about at least 15 more minutes and then we can go to questions, Manuela, that would be great.
Okay. I can, all right, 15 more minutes worth. Okay. So remember when I showed you that onion? When I showed you the onion of systemic racism and systemic oppression. So I wanted to tell you a little bit, we anticipated a little bit what were those layers, right? So the oldest layer, right, that we were talking about is the Indian Act in Canada, in terms that it creates the only existing racially segregated society. I mean, after apartheid, right? In the Western world, there's no other racially segregated society where people carry kind of like IDs and things like that. Residential schools, the government control of indigenous identity, and the control of access to land and resources, right? That's very important. Never forget that the research system and the residential school system and the government control of identity all have an impact on the ability of people to have access to resources and land, which are the ultimate, you know, source of every other aspect of people's lives. When we talk about putting together a legislation or a policy like this, we better have a good reason, right, to convince people about this legislation. So to make sense, to legitimize and rationalize this structure that we've created of having like research and residential schools, right, we have, I'm mentioning here at least 3 big cultural narratives, right? One is the doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. The doctrine of discovery and terra nullius, of course, is the idea, the erroneous idea that Europeans found a vacant, empty land in Turtle Island, right? That there was no government, just nature and indigenous people sort of like as part of nature, so that it provides, it legitimizes European authority over indigenous people. Scientific racism, which we could spend like another hour and a half talking in itself, right, is the, you know, all the body of scientific knowledge that was created about the superiority, the racial superiority of Europeans or quote unquote Caucasians. And in another talk, I can explain to you why that is a wrong term. But scientific racism gave the idea that white people had sort of like a duty to the inferior races. And in North America, both slave owners and white settlers love this idea and run with it. They're like, we have a duty to protect and educate and save these inferior races, right? The myth of meritocracy, right? The idea that, oh, listen, if you work hard, everybody gets the same, right? The doctrine of discovery is so harmful that there's actually a TRC call that specifically talks about repudiating at all levels the doctrine of discovery. I like this quote. It was in the context of the Wet'suwet'en invasion. Yeah, unceded lands, right? As a in the case of Coast Salish, unceded territory, never sold, never given away, never vacant. When we talk about structural and cultural, then when we start talking about individual institutions, right, such as, you know, educational institutions, healthcare, justice system, right? All these institutions in themselves are going to have manifestations of this larger racism, right? For example, lack of meaningful diversity, biased policies, biased hiring practices, right? So, like, remember all the thing about professionalism norms being very like white-centered, and, you know, so biased hiring practices, the constant silencing of claims of racism, right, as and protecting institutions. We see this a lot with big institutions like universities, right? They rush to save the integrity of their institution rather than recognize that they have problematic biases and practices. And it is in institutions when these deficit discourses and racist narratives of indigenous inferiority are normalized, right? So, for example, what do I mean by normalized? Like teachers starting to have low expectations about indigenous students, right? As a norm. Nurses making the assumption that every indigenous person that is coming is an alcoholic or a drug addict and making a moral judgment about that, etc. Oh, all the different fonts. Sorry about that. It's hurting my eyes. And then we have, you know, going deeper inside the onion, when you're inside institutions that already have these dynamics, it's when you have the incidents at the individual level, right? That you see sort of like at Walmart on videos or whatever, right? When there's actual sort of like a visible incident. And then the last layer of the onion, again, as I was saying, is the ways that we have internalized or made ours these fictions of racial superiority and inferiority and gender superiority and inferiority, right? So that shows in both, you know, the side of entitlement, people that, you know, just feel entitled by society to do anything, and people that on the other, you know, and on the spectrum, people that internalize their own inferiority in a way that even if they have 3 PhDs, they don't feel prepared, right? Unconscious and implicit bias, we all have it, right? Unless you were born in Wakanda, we all have a colonized subjectivity that has internalized these hierarchies, right? And we have investments on whiteness, right? Proximity, try to emulate whiteness. You can see these on like our immigrants that are racialized immigrants that are invited to perform whiteness more than anything, right? So their lawn has to be the most manicured of the whole, you know, block, and they have the most candidate shirts. So how much we, you know, try to benefit even people of color by proximity to whiteness. I wanted to go a little bit into the misconceptions about systemic racism and why things like, you know, oh, we will fix racism by celebrating diversity. It's like, well, celebrating diversity, right, doesn't really tackle the layers of, you know, of racism that we have been just discussing, and also the fact that we can't just pretend that adding indigenous culture to the colonial structure is gonna sort of like undo some of those narratives and practices, right? So if you've noticed, I've focused a lot on that idea that there's discourses or narratives, right? Which is your realm, culture, but also practices, which is also what we all do, right? Like the practices and the things that we do based on those ideas. So I don't know if I should leave it there. Oh, so just, do I have time to just like
I would, Manuela, I would just take the time that you want. There's a lot of messages from people saying, keep talking, and not a lot of questions that I'm receiving. So I would say keep speaking.
I'll keep speaking, and yes, please, if there's questions. So I guess this is what I wanted to show. I love this. This is obviously what do you call it? No, is this a meme? Sorry, guys, I'm a Gen Xer, so I'm not so good with the language. I'm trying to show this as a slideshow, right? But what happens when we talk about diversity and inclusion without talking about equity, right? What happens is that we kind of, you know, when we don't talk about power, but we talk about diversity and inclusion, right? A lot of people are thinking about this, right? Which means that if you have, like, you know, if you have hired people of color in the bottom, that then the problem is solved, and you don't need to think about the barriers that impact kind of like all these other levels, right? And also, why would people of color, and women for that matter, be included in a structure that already sees them as in deficit or inferior, right? Like, who wants to be part of a structure that inherently like dehumanizes you or sees you as inferior? So I guess this is what I wanted to, these are my awesome visuals. When we focus on diversity and inclusion, right, on forcing diversity and inclusion without centering your attention on equity, meaning on the structures and the barriers, you end up having what we call tokenism, right? Which can be sort of like a step and a continuum from going to, you know, a colonial, to a tokenistic, to a diverse, to an anti-racist or an equitable institution. It can be a step, right? Like we'll say, okay, we don't have a ramp, but we'll carry somebody for this meeting. And then, you know, but when you focus on the barrier itself, right, the outcome is diversity and inclusion, right? When you focus on actually addressing the barriers themselves that are preventing people from coming to those tables, then diversity and inclusion is an effect. I forgot to do something really important at the beginning of my talk, which I just remembered using this slide, which is I really wanted to acknowledge my femtors, because many of these ideas that I'm presenting here today are the result of my conversations with colleagues and mentors and femtors. And in particular, I wanted to mention Becky Sasakamus-Kufner, who works at the city of Saskatoon and has been a huge mentor in my learning. Dr. Sheila McLean, who you read from, Dr. Verna St. Denis, but also my colleague Sharisa Hanke, my colleague Russell McCulley, and others that we're continually learning from each other. I could mention others like Janessa Chapola, that we keep learning about these issues from our different positions, right? From, you know, being indigenous, being a settler, being a racialized settler, etc. I think that I should probably just leave it there because I have lots of words and lots of slides that I could keep showing, but I'm also interested in learning how you're receiving, what are your questions, what are your thoughts? So maybe I'll leave it there and we can have a little bit more of a conversation.
Thank you so much, Manuela. That was really, really inspiring. I'll start with a question that I've just seen come up in the chat. It's from Alejandro Romero, who I think you know. You started to smile.
My favorite Boricua.
And I'm so glad he's asking this question because I would have started it with systematic ways of the structural ways in which grantors, in which funders work, and that would include SaskArts, that would include some of Alejandro's, certainly former associations, are based on really colonial structures. So can you provide some examples of how to change those barriers?
I wonder if that's something that could be a good conversation to have, which is how do we shift this narrative of, oh, people are not interested in arts and culture, right? If we only have, and okay, let me be mean. If we have a play and we have like only affluent, older white people come, are those are the only people interested in culture? Or do we have some barriers going on there that we need to unpack, right? If the people that's in terms of audiences, if the artists that we keep showcasing kind of like have a very, you know, similar demographic, or they need to, you know, I don't know specifically what are the criteria that you put for funding, but it could be like things like formal education is a barrier. Criminal record checks are a huge barrier just because we know that Indigenous people don't commit more crimes. We know that they are over-policed and over-incarcerated. So you're Indigenous, you're just more likely to have an encounter with police that might result in a criminal record. And that's a huge barrier for a lot of Indigenous people. And I'm not saying just remove it because I don't know what are the like legalities around it, right? But I'm just saying we know that those are barriers in the same way that we know that for people living in remote communities, transport is increasingly a barrier, especially after the demise of RCC. Right. The Alejandro is reflecting of some of the barriers right there, right? Yeah, like the ability to write a grant, right? That's a very like, you know, it's a skill that has to do with formal education. So that's a really, really good question, Alejandro. We should like have a workshop on that.
I think that's a really, really great idea. Alejandro also says to everyone, some barriers are non-Canadian education, language, writing skills, experiences. So I absolutely think that. Does anybody else have questions that they'd like to, as again, the way that we should do this is you could forward your questions through chat directly to me because we can't activate, we are not activating individual microphones in this.
Can I say something? Just to get you mad, so you asked me something. But like sometimes it feels like the art and cultural world, it's a little bit tame politically. Well, I come from Chile, so I come from South America, and our arts are so politically and socially, you know, oriented, and it's like everything is about history of social movements and stuff. But I mean, I've seen some really amazing pieces lately. What was it that I saw? Cowboys and villages or something like that. Like there's some really great but like I would love to oh yeah. But you know, like how could we have like, do we have an art that is really doing a function of like interrogating our society, being critical, reflecting on what's happening, power, making fun of the emperor's new clothes? Where's you know that graffiti artist, right? Yeah. What other forms of art, urban art, You know, how much does elitism and class shape the way that we view and consume art? Like, just throw in a bunch of things there. Maybe it raises some questions.
Anybody else wish to tackle this? Because I think that's a really interesting challenge. While you're thinking on that, because I'm hoping that someone will rise to the challenge of your question, Manuela. We've received another question from Tara Hogue, who is in fact the next speaker in this series next month. So Tara's asking, how does your work for equity manifest in the university? She's curious to know more about that.
So I'm the director of a division called Social Accountability. And we try to uphold the whole College of Medicine accountable to the mandate of creating professionals that are prepared to serve the priority health concerns of the community. And that also have tools to promote health equity, right? We have a model of health right now that is completely based on deficit. It's completely racist, moralistic, and it's very profit driven. Like, it's like as if the doctors and the pharmacological companies were the protagonists and the patients and the communities were, you know, secondary, whereas it's the health of the community. So I do a lot of work in terms of introducing health equity as a framework to understand the role of physicians, and to calling physicians out on their obligation of being also advocates for health equity, and to speaking up about the social determinants of health, right? Because, yeah, you can tell people to eat well and exercise, but, you know, if they live in a place where water is contaminated with mercury, or a lettuce, you have to pay $100 for lettuce, you know what I mean? Like, no, that doesn't make any sense. So really to look at what I do there, it has to do with, well, of course, making visible all the colonialism and the racism and the patriarchal structures that are embedded in medical education. But yeah, also how to intervene in the outcomes of health.
I have a couple of people, Manuela, who are trying to tackle the challenge that you've placed. I'm going to read a couple of responses and then let you give back your thoughts to some of these. Caitlin McCullum-Arnold writes, how does colonialism play into the global perception that Canadians are nice? Mm-hmm. And does that play into our art? Is that one of the reasons that our art might be tame? Sarah Simison, who I know is in Moose Jaw at the Festival of Words there, writes, could artists and arts organizations be holding back in some ways because so many receive government funding? They don't want to upset politicians by getting too political with their work. I'll do one more and then I'm going to let you respond to these. Mirta writes, art is very elitist and consider other expressions as not as quality because the expression comes from people without academic background. And those are some thoughts.
They're great reflections. Thank you for this. These are really good points. I totally agree. I forgot who made the first comment about the nice politeness, the global role as the nice ones. Who said that?
That was Caitlin McCullum-Arnold.
Yeah, Caitlin, I agree with that. And it's like, I feel bad to tell people, like, Canadians, because I love being here in Canada. Okay, let's make that clear. And I love living in Treaty 6. I'm very, you know, but in Canada, there's such an oppressive politeness. like a silencing sense of niceness that I think it's really, and I call it oppressive, because I think that the sense of politeness and niceness that we have, it's really meant to silence, you know, people who say like, hey, but isn't that like not fair? And it was like, that's rude, right? You're rude if you point out at the power structures, or, you know, you're rude if you ask a question about, well, why this and not something else, right? So I think that this oppressive British politeness is so much at the center of our culture, right? It's, yeah, it's there. And I absolutely agree that has to do with being funded by governments who, you know, and people like feeling like limited and constrained about what they can say in terms of that. The idea that there's kind of like high and low art, right? Like better ways of art. And I would add also this idea that art is kind of like entertainment to be consumed, as opposed to, you know, the right of humans to express their conditions of their life or whatever in artistic ways. And that includes all kinds of things like, you know, punk and hip hop and, you know, graffiti, as we were talking about, urban forms of art, etc.
And there's a couple more people who are getting into this conversation. Tara Hogue writes again that she would say that there's a consciousness in the art world about how political art can be instrumentalized by institutions to make them look better without addressing systemic inequities of institutional structure. David Garneau writes about art as window dressing versus art as politics by other means. Tracy Foster, who is at Listen to This Community Arts, writes, I feel political art is being created and is possibly not being supported or witnessed all that well. Is it possible that ableism and colonialism have nurtured entertainment as art? At Listen to This, they're making crip art in Saskatchewan that interrupts the societal normative perspective of disability. And unless they're presented by the Globe, for example, they cannot build an audience because their art is considered negative.
Ooh. Oh my God, I wish Alana Moore was in this conversation. I don't know if she is, but about ability, on the question about ability. I love this reflection because it really hits the nail on the head, that this idea that art has to be kind of like a pretty thing to consume and serve as window dressing, as opposed to, no, art can look as the expression of something like grief and anger, right? And it can still be beautiful in a different way. But I was asking that because, well, one, I'm from South America, and art has had a huge function in our social movements and social struggles. But I'm also always been very interested in this idea of the utopian function of art, right? I don't know if you're familiar with Ernst Bloch, who is a German philosopher that talked about the utopian function of art. I don't mean to get too academic, but basically the idea of art, not, well, also, you know, as an expression of our lives and our feelings and our collective, you know, conditions, but also as a way to point at the things that we can't imagine yet as possible, right? Because there's things that we can't desire, right? Because we don't even imagine them, right? There's a big comment there that I wanted to read, but yeah, how much art can pushes us to imagine other ways of living together, other ways of relating to each other.
Okay, I'll try to get that big one out for you. This actually comes from one of our staff members. In English language Canadian literature, an apolitical, justice-neutral stance has been codified into aesthetics and poetics. Apart from spoken word, work that takes a stance, argues for social change, or challenges societal presuppositions is dismissed as didactic, simplistic, or artistically compromised. A novel thematically like those in Eastern Europe or Latin America would be marginalized, consigned to a few leftist presses. So that is a question about canon in literature.
So that's Joanne?
Yes, that's Joanne Gerber.
Joanne, I agree. And I would add that I would put in a lot of quotes, this idea of the neutral stance, right? We just lost Desmond Tutu a couple of weeks ago, and he had that famous quote that, you know, in a situation of injustice, there's no neutral stance, right? You can comply with the status quo, but that's not neutral. Complying with the status quo, which is harmful, is not a neutral position. It's already a stance in itself, right? So I think it's interesting how we code that, like respecting the status quo as neutral. Oh, and Daryl said that, yeah, I agree, Daryl. I rarely do an acknowledgement without following up with, like, well, what does it mean for me, right? So I think you're right. When we need to start using that recognition of Treaty 6, of saying like, okay, so, and so what, right? How does this translate into my practice, right? How does the fact that I have committed responsibilities towards sovereign indigenous nations, right, shape my work and ground what I'm doing today?
Okay, Oscar at the Moose Jaw Cultural Center has a really interesting question. In your opinion, can a multicultural, multiracial society, can it be viable? If that's the case, which country society can represent that concept the closest at this moment?
Yeah, and that's the problem, hey, that when we're thinking multicultural, is not the same as saying like decolonized, right? Because multicultural is a model that already it doesn't dismantle the colonialism that is at the center of our state. It kind of like says we'll leave the white center intact, but we'll incorporate all the other cultures so that once a month we'll have a multicultural party, everybody will bring their food, and we'll consume everybody's like difference, right? But Sylvia is, I'm glad I made you laugh. You know, but it's, that doesn't, like going to powwows, eating tacos doesn't really dismantle the whiteness at the center that is structuring the center, right? So it's not, the problem with multiculturalism is that on one hand, it keeps looking from the center out, right? Looking out and celebrates that diversity in a way that doesn't recognize the power dynamics between those different cultures, right? Now, we may be eating everybody's food, but this is not like historically, you know.
I think Alejandro is agreeing with you, and I apologize for not keeping up with all of his comments as they go by in the everyone chat. But he says we're all multicultural and we live together, but it's the system that segregates with colonialism.
Yeah, so I agree that we can live in, we live in multiracial societies, right? The problem is, can we create societies that are equitable, right? That are racially equitable and just, that have sort of like similar outcomes, that the outcomes that people have are not shaped by how they're perceived racially. Does that make sense? So,
yep. I have a really interesting, returning to an earlier conversation from Ellery Russell. who writes, I'm part of a group of artists who are of settler and indigenous culture who want to speak to your question, politically charged questions, through art. The plan is to question colonial structures while promoting equity throughout Canada through art and written word. So what would you recommend as far as keeping that narrative effective? Oh, you've muted yourself, Manuela, somehow.
Sorry, I heard the first part of the question, but I didn't hear the last one.
Okay, Ellery is part of a group of artists who are challenging, both Indigenous and settler, who are challenging political questions through their artwork. So what would you recommend as far as keeping their narrative effective?
Nice. Well, I honestly, I find that a way that it's effective to address these issues, and you probably already have it because you're working with Indigenous peoples, is sense of humor, right? Because I think white people are so terrified to talk about this and be kind of like pointed as like that they're gonna have to like feel, bad or guilty, and like there's so much kind of like, like, how could I call it, like people don't want to touch this because they might make a mistake, and God forbids we make a mistake, right? So I think it's good to kind of like use sense of humor, and I don't know what I can recommend you to keep the message effective in terms of art. How to reach, I mean, this is like $1 million question, right? How to be more effective, how to reach more. Well, I guess a thing would be to really try to speak to maybe audiences that were not engaging. So for example, I'm thinking, how do we reach out to like white rural communities in Saskatchewan, right? How do we reach out to people that, I don't know, are listening to, can I say, are listening to, okay, I'm just gonna say to problematic, leaders or whatever. Like, I think it's a really good question. I don't know if I have the complete answer.
I have an interesting question, which I'm not sure whether it came from one of my staff members, so I'm not sure whether it was for a challenge to me or a question for you, but I'm turning it into a question for you. Carol Grey Eyes, who's in Saskatoon, writes, can you talk about the difference between decolonizing an institution as opposed to indigenizing an institution?
That's a really good question. And I know this language has been thrown around, like in the university, it's like, we have all of them. We have like EDI strategy, reconciliation, indigenization. Like nobody even understands kind of like what it, I think, let me attempt at like, because I'm not sure what, I think indigenization has been sort of like a little bit of a way out, in the same way that reconciliation has been a way out of not making substantial changes, not transforming our structures in a substantial way, so that we can kind of like, again, add indigenous culture to what we already have. I've always suspected that that's what's at the root of indigenizing is like, okay, we'll like sprinkle some indigenous things in it. Whereas when I think about decolonization, I think about a more like as a radical, political process of recognizing the sovereignty of indigenous people and the sovereignty of their systems of, accessing land and resources and political sovereignty, and that's and really kind of like challenging the tenets of colonialism, which is white supremacy, right? And I'm not sure that indigenization always refers to that, but I would be interested in what you think. Yeah.
I have a comment from Sylvia Skene. I'm sorry, Sylvia, I'm not sure how to pronounce your last name. She writes, when I organized a panel of Indigenous writers and poets a few years back on resisting CanLit, I think this is returning to Joanne's question and comment, the discussion went sideways. And I realized that my role as a privileged person was to hold space for those who seldom could speak, not to decide for them what to say.
Thank you, Sylvia. And you know what? That's something very important to say, that this work of being figuring out how to be an ally and how to hold space and pass the mic for people that are constantly pushed to the margins can sometimes be, again, you're going to make mistakes. We're all very bound to make mistakes. And we have to lose the terror, deep-seated fear. It's like, if there was a horror movie for Canadians, it would be like mistakes, right? Like being caught publicly and making a mistake, which is like obvious that if we're learning how to roller skate, we're gonna fall a couple times. But why, when we're trying to be an ally, we expect that we're gonna slay at the beginning, like right on, right? So I think it's a very important insight that you're sharing, right? That sometimes with very good intentions, we're saying, oh, I'm gonna do this. And then we learn like, oh, I think that it would have been better if like, this is what I was really meant to do, just create this space. So I encourage you to keep learning from like those things. And again, a lot of people like take it so personal, like it's like their whole identity is at stake if they make a mistake, as opposed to, you know what, getting rid of these old like colonial, messages that we've internalized is gonna be hard. We should support each other. Yeah, work through our mistakes. I want to mention really quick that if you're interested, there's a group in Saskatoon that you can look up, and it's called SYRXE, YXE, and it's an acronym for Showing Up for Racial Justice, and it's a group of allies. It's a group for white allies to practice solidarity, have a space of support and accountability with each other. And yeah, find spaces in which you feel supported and you can talk about this, like, wow, I made a mistake. And you can say like, wow, I didn't realize that I was doing that. I was totally assuming, like, when I started being called out, that I wasn't announcing that, a lot of Indigenous people was getting triggered in my talks. And I was like, I totally didn't see it. Thank you. Thank you for making me notice that mistake.
Aaron G has just actually sent me the note for SYRXE's Facebook page. Aaron, could I ask you to repost that for the full group? Every time I try to cut and paste something, it isn't working right now. We're wrapping up our talk. This has been really exciting, but I'm going to leave a moment for last questions. Someone has asked, I think it was Caitlin, asked about the artist from the beginning, and I think that was Kenneth Monkman, if I'm remembering correctly. Is that right? The artist whose work you showed at the beginning? I have a comment. There's a long comment from Madonna Hamill, who's an artist who's lived all over the country and now lives in a white rural village in Saskatchewan, population of 89. The language revolves around farm and family, weather and animals. These are topics that are common to everyone in the world. When we celebrate Storytelling Day in March, we encourage everybody to tell their stories by handing out question cards like, what was your worst winter? What happened? Basic stuff that everyone can relate to. That process was begun by herself and Joseph Natauhau. They avoid academic language at these events, noting that people would head for the hills. Oh, we've lost your microphone again.
I love what you're saying. I really want to appreciate that comment, Madonna, because as a South American, I believe in the pedagogy of the oppressed, right? And that literacy and theory literacy is something that we build with people from the ground up, from their experiences, right? We can theorize about our living conditions and how to change them. The reason for theory, the reason for feminist theory, for anti-racist theory, is to transform its structure. Not for us to have fancy, sophisticated language to show off at events, right? This theory that I'm using right now has been built from the ground up with people. So I agree, that is the way. Going to live with people and share their spaces and learn from them and about their lives, and from there theorize and reflect critically with art. Why not? Reflect critically with art about your living conditions and what's happening. Why? Oh, I was showing Education for Critical Consciousness, but his most famous book is The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And there was a big movement in the 60s in South America about like literacy for social change, for social transformation.
And one last comment, an oversight that Colleen Charlotte is pointing out is the inherent clash between matriarchal and patriarchal societies, noting that a philosophy of humanism, there's no superior or inferior, there's only human.
Yeah, it's a colonial construct. It's coloniality brought that patriarchal thinking to the Americans. We didn't have it in South America. We didn't have it in North America, right? But it's colonialism that introduced the idea of male supremacy, right? Our indigenous societies had a lot of dualistic thinking in terms of complementarity, right, of the genders, and fluidity too.
As we wrap up today, first of all, thank you so much, Manuela. This was incredible. It was energizing. It was stimulating. It was challenging. And I'm seeing a number of people sending both to everyone, but directly to me to express their thanks to you. This has been really, really exciting. I hope that everyone here found this session exciting and challenging and helpful as you all consider and continue your own diversity, equity, inclusion work. A couple of thanks before we break up. I want to thank Alex Radowski and Jeff Smith on our staff did the curating for this session. And so I'm really pleased that they've introduced me to the work of Manuela. And also, of course, special thanks to Jeff, who made all of the arrangements for today's session, including sending you all a change of Zoom rooms just yesterday when we began panicking about capacity. Special thanks, of course, to Manuela, both for providing us with inspiration and for challenging us to be better in our work. The next speaker, as I mentioned actually during the questions, in SaskArt's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Speaker Series is Tara Hogue. She's a writer and a curator who's known for her work with Indigenous art. Tara's session is scheduled for 10 a.m. on February 17th. And you can register again by sending an email to jeff@sk-arts.ca. As I mentioned earlier, the session was recorded. I'm going to ask Jeff, and I haven't pre-warned him, that as soon as that session is available and online through our website, that a note can be sent to all of you just to let you know that it's there so you can go back to it again. Thank you for joining us today, and really to everyone, have a wonderful day.